All right, so this is the grain storage area, as you can see by all the dust and whatnot over there. This is where those grains I showed you back in the museum are kept. The big white vats behind me hold the grains that we use most often, things like pale malt and wheat malt. These 50-pound bags next to me that say Greece and Cargill and so forth on them hold the specialty grains, dark malt and so forth. Around this room you can see various things strewn about that are ingredients for a number of our beers. We have dried pumpkin powder for the pumpkin ale. We've got some orange peel for the number 15. Nutmeg is going to be for the Christmas ale and so forth. This is the room where the brewing process actually starts. Right behind this wall there is a machine called a grist mill. And what that is it's almost like a giant coffee grinder. You know, when you make coffee, you can't just take coffee beans and throw them in water. You could, but you would have a very, very weak coffee. Same thing's going on with beer. Beer is produced by taking barley or some grain and soaking it in water, and you're getting a steep. You're getting a sugary barley slurry, if you will. In order for that to happen efficiently, you have to ground up the grains a little bit. Otherwise, you're going to get a very, very weak beer, and that isn't any fun for anybody. So that's what the grist mill is for. This machine is affixed to a piping system which pumps grain from here all the way in the back to the kitchen area where the beer is brewed. And that's where we're going to go next. So if you want to follow me this way. So the grain is pumped through pipes that terminate on top of this platform in that funnel up there. And from there, the grains can be dropped into the mash tun, which is behind me. It's got a yellow hose on it. It says mash tun. And this is the first step in the brewing process proper. What's happening during mashing? This is where the starch conversion takes place. So I mentioned before, you know, when you're chewing on those malt kernels, they kind of start off really cereally and then they become sweeter and sweeter. That's the process that we're doing essentially on a large scale in here in the mash tun. So what we're doing is we're soaking the milled grains in water for about 30 minutes from 140 to 160 degrees or so. And that's going to allow the starch conversion to take place so we can ferment the beer later on. When that process is complete, the grains as well as the mash water are transferred to this, which is called the water tun. There's a false bottom in here. The grains sit on top of the false bottom and make kind of like a filter. The water filters from the top into the bottom. We also spray some additional water in the top of this mechanism. There's like a swirling kind of sprinkler arm. And what we're doing is we're rinsing the sugar off the grain that we've put onto the grains from the mashing process. And then all that collects down here in the hot liquor tank. And what we have left is unfermented beer, a substance referred to as wort. Wort is a German word meaning unfermented beer. As far as the grains are concerned, I was talking to a gentleman about this a minute ago. These grains are transferred into this bin that you see right here. And a farmer actually comes down from Illinois and picks these up and feeds it to his livestock. So you've probably noticed that we try to be as green as we possibly can around here. This is one of the ways in which we do that. Also, you have to get rid of this stuff within a few hours, otherwise it starts to smell like nasty gym socks. You don't want this spent grain sitting around. All right, the brew kettle is over this way if you want to inch forward another couple yards here. It's another shiny silver canister. We have a lot of these around the brewery. All right, so the brew kettle is where the wort is boiled for about an hour to an hour and a half. Two things are occurring here. Number one, we're sanitizing the brew. We're making sure any bacteria or anything like that is killed and it's not going to ruin our batch later on. The other thing we're doing in the brew kettle is flavoring the beer with hops. As I mentioned before, the longer you boil hops, the more bitter they become. The less you boil them, the more of those flavors and aromas are going to be left in your beer. So we'll add some hops at the beginning of the boil, add another batch maybe 20 to 30 minutes out from the end, and then a third right at the end. And of course, this is going to vary greatly depending on what particular beer we're producing at that time. Some of our beers undergo a fourth hop addition, which occurs during fermentation. It's called dry hop. This is where that smell from the APA and the Pilsner, that really citrusy, piney smell on those beers. Those have been filtered through fresh hops during fermentation, so that's where that smell comes from. Next is the whirlpool, which is behind me right there. As you'll notice, it says caution hot, because this is often the recipient of wort. When the wort gets in here, it's still boiling hot. Once I was doing a tour here on a Friday, a few weeks ago, and on Fridays the brewery is actually in operation. I put my hand out and I burned the heck out of my hand because I'm a moron. So don't do that. Don't touch things that tell you not to touch them. But what is this used for? There is, at this point, a whole bunch of solids floating around in our beer. Grain that's made through the lautering process, hops, proteins. It's a nasty, sticky substance called trub. In order to get rid of that stuff, we have this whirlpooling mechanism. It creates a vortex in here. The solids collect in the center, and we can pull the wort off the side. It clarifies the wort, if you will. All right. Next, we have to cool down our unfermented beer, because if we tried to add yeast right now, it's going to die, just like anything else, bacteria. You don't want to put that in boiling water. This is a plate heat exchanger. This machine allows two liquids to pass side by side. One liquid is our hot unfermented beer. The other liquid is cold water. And as they pass each other, the heat jumps from one to the other. So you actually end up with unfermented beer around 70 degrees and hot water. It's a very quick, efficient way to get the beer down to temperature without having to mess around with ice or anything like that. Then we take one of these hoses and hook it up to our kegs on wheels, and we pitch the yeast along with some oxygen into the wort. And then fermentation begins. Over there in the fermentation cellar. So that's where we're going to head later on, or actually right this second. Just technically later, I guess. So let's go this way. All right, so this is an end of our fermentation cellar. If you can see back here, these tanks go way, way back to the back wall of the brewery. There are many of these tanks floating around in here. But this is one of them that you can see up close. This is where the beer is fermented. As you can see, these tanks have these cone-shaped bottoms. This is for when the fermentation is complete and the yeast settles out. The yeast collects at the bottom of these tanks, and it's an easy way to get the beer out of there without having a whole bunch of yeast in your beer. It's an easy way to collect the yeast and collect the beer and separate it. So, fermentation. There are two main families of beer. Does anyone know what they are?
Ale and lager.
Ale and lager, very good. This is when you're making one or the other. Ales are fermented at room temperature, about 68 to 70 degrees. They ferment relatively quickly, generally under 10 days or so. And they use a top fermenting yeast, and all that means is that the yeast works on the top of the brew as it's fermenting. Lagers, on the other hand, take quite a bit longer. They use a bottom fermenting yeast, and they're fermented at about 55 degrees or so. Generally speaking, lagers have a cleaner flavor than ales. They're getting less fruitiness off of their yeast strain. They tend to be less complicated, easier to drink, as many people say. Lagers are more complex and more robust. Or ales are, excuse me.